best introduction I could have asked for in covering a lot of the ecology behind the work that we're out there doing. I want to look a little closer at the partnerships, the people behind the work, and who's working together, and how we're bringing all these resources together to try and accomplish these very large-scale restoration projects. So I want to start off with an introduction to the Partners Program. And the Partners for Fish and Wildlife Program is kind of the Department of the Interior is with Fish and Wildlife Service. And it's our kind of sister program to the NRCS programs. They're very similar in nature. We work on native habitats out there appropriate to the area. So really quick, it is landowner based, so we're working on non-state, non-federal lands. And it's a cost-sharing program, very similar to how, if you're familiar with any of the NRCS programs, we work under much the same cost-sharing principles. Our goals are, in general, out there to protect and restore critical and native habitats. And we're interested in federal trust species, and that can cover migratory birds, threatened or endangered species, or some state or locally listed species of interest. So, of course, that covers our sage grouse. Each office, region, and then nationally, there are strategic plans that have been stepped down from each other to work in conjunction at all those three levels. Each plan has these 5 goals to it, and then each office then expands on these goals for our local needs in working with our partners to do so. So we're out there talking to the NRCS, talking to all the NGOs, talking to our state organizations to determine what their key goals are, and then making ours to be compatible with those so that we're either covering gaps that are needed or enhancing and strengthening their own goals. So, of course, conservation habitat is pretty self-explanatory, out there to restore habitat. Broadening and strengthening partnerships is doing things like this, coming out here and presenting to folks like yourselves so that a greater awareness of the needs of the programs that are out there. Improving our information sharing talks about making databases. We've talked about how do you get those maps, where is this stuff. This is something that I admit we haven't been very good at, but we're trying to improve those databases and make this information available to the land managers that are out there and need it. Enhancing our workforce is just talking very strictly about the number of boots on the ground. And in today's economy, as I'll touch on later, the partnerships are the only way we're really going to improve on that. And then increasing our accountability, because we are the government, so we have to do that. So this map shows Region 8, which is Nevada, California, and a small little bump of Oregon up there. And this is Fish and Wildlife's designation of Region 8. All of the blotches on there are our focus areas. So the Partners Program can work anywhere in these states, but these are what we've identified as key areas. So the 2 I would point out that I consider most important are this big blue blob here and the little green one right there. And that's where I specifically am working. So there you can see about where it is. You see Alturas is right in here, Susanville is down here somewhere. So in specific to the sage grouse and the work that we're doing with the sage grouse, we are working on a complement. Our goals are to complement the NRCS's Sage Grouse Initiative. They really have been the workhorse behind it and been pushing the initiative. And so our goal is not to recreate it, but to come in and support it. So of course we're looking at the sage grouse, which, as most of you know, is listed as a candidate. It was determined to be eligible to be listed as threatened or endangered, but due to other species that are on the list and the priorities that have been set, it was determined that we could list it as a candidate and give the managers out there an opportunity to turn the population around, make significant strives in its recovery, and hopefully, potentially, prevent it from needing to be listed. The listing as a candidate, though, gave us some additional tools that we wouldn't have otherwise had. So we are able to treat the sage grouse in a way similar to how we would treat a threatened or endangered species that is actually listed. We can give it certain protections, we can give the landowners certain protections and rights as they do work on it, and we can also funnel additional funds towards it that we don't necessarily have the authority to funnel towards a species that was not listed or a candidate. So the landowner's assurances is usually the part where people get hung up. And first I'll preclude this with, I'm not an ES biologist, environmental services biologist. I work with the Threatened Endangered Species Act kind of as an implementer, but not as a policymaker. So I will tell you a little about this, but please don't hammer me too hard on it. We work on these candidate conservation agreements and assurances. This is a documentation that's put together. It's done by the Fish and Wildlife Service with the implementation of all other land managers and interested parties. The concept behind this is that we're setting out best management practices and then telling landowners that if you go ahead and follow these best management practices, which would become implemented if it was listed as threatened or endangered, then in the event that that species becomes listed, you get certain assurances. If you set up grazing practices according to this plan, and after it's listed, those are determined that it should be changed, you have an assurance to continue your operations because you did it in advance. You got into this in advance. So that's what we're looking at. And questions to CC were, why would a landowner want to do this? Some of these assurances that we can set up in advance help landowners make that decision that this is a good thing for them to go out there and do. Unfortunately, right now, the only one we have is in Wyoming, so it's not, California doesn't have one yet. There's been work on it, and I'm not sure how far out it is. At the field office level, though, we're looking strictly at the restoration. Like the NRCS is doing, we are going out there, trying to find landowners that are interested in determining the best management practices and then assisting them in implementing these practices. So we're working directly with the landowners, cooperation with NRCS and other land management organizations in the area. A lot of what Fish and Wildlife does, though, under the partners programs, we don't leverage the large dollars that some other organizations can have available to them. Some of that is we are primarily funded through your hunting taxes, your duck stamps, money like that. So our money is a bit more variable. So we don't have the farm bill funds. We don't receive any of that because that's from ag. So we're looking at a lot of the follow-up restorations. They tend to be a little less expensive than the actual juniper removal, although we do go out and cut juniper ourselves. But as CC had mentioned, a lot of times there's seeding required. David had talked a little bit about the water usage, and on occasion we see springs and things that come back up after this juniper has been removed. So we're going out there looking at ditches that may be draining these wet meadows that are needed for the brood rearing, areas that maybe need to be reseeded or fencing that might need to be moved to remove it out of a lek area or out of a critical spot, and helping landowners to set up the rotational grazing in a way that doesn't impact these areas. So I've mentioned a lot about all of our other partners that we work with, and this is not a complete list. This is just a smattering of a few of them we work with. And you see it's quite a range. We've got land trust organizations, we've got nationwide organizations, organizations that are more associated with their hunters or whatever, but even organizations like Ducks Unlimited, they see a broader benefit to this kind of work. And so a lot of them will get involved in these things when they're approached and asked for help. So traits of a good partnership, and I'm sure everybody already knows this, but You're looking for people that you have a shared core value with. You're working towards those same goals, or complementary goals to each other. You have complementary skills, and a lot of times why NRCS and Fish and Wildlife have been working so closely together on the Sage Grouse Initiative is that we can share those resources. Not everybody can afford to hire a hydrologist. Not everybody can afford to have a forester on hand. And so we pool those resources to get that knowledge around and the money around that's needed. And of course you're looking for a shared passion, which I feel everybody in this room probably has that same passion. And then problem solving. Not all projects go down as planned, so. All right, so looking at this image here shows you an example of some of the follow-up work. This is on a project that we're working on up in the Goose Lake Basin area in Oregon. And this has been a ditched out system. This is a low-running creek that's being utilized as a ditch. And post-treatment of the Juniper, this ran just a little trickle. Or sorry, pre-treatment. Post-treatment, then this water started to run a little faster. So what we're looking at is coming in and funds that were originally attributed to this project could not cover any of this water hydrology work. So we come in to put in small check dams, improve bank and shoreline riparian area, and try and back this water up into meadows and all that would be up further above. So this concept of working together with ranchers and large tract landowners. The NRCS and Fish and Wildlife Service several years ago have a program called Working Lands for Wildlife. And this effort, it's not really an initiative, but this effort is trying to find that common ground between the ranchers and the conservationists, and trying to help them work together to achieve these larger goals. The importance of this is we know in this area large tracts of land are owned privately. And at this point the federal government's property is what it is. It's probably not going to expand much at all. 2/3 of all threatened and endangered species are actually found on private lands, and the private lands are their primary resource that they need to survive. So these two factors alone make it essential that we expand outside of our little federal boxes and work with private landowners in the area. So the Working Lands for Wildlife, again, is looking to bring in that expertise, that shared funding, and looking at larger landscape scale effects. Looking at, if we do this work here, how's it going to affect over there? Where do we need to go next? Where's the species at? Not just where they're lekking, but where do they need to lay, to nest, and where do they need to be raising their broods, and how are they going to get there? Which is a much bigger factor in trying to create these corridors between this habitat. And Cassie actually pointed out, I didn't realize that they moved that far, but I knew they moved quite far. And so if they don't have these safe corridors of transportation and resting areas in between, how are they going to expand out? In addition to being this kind of more official effort, Working Lands for Wildlife also just is a kind of an idea or an ideology that we can work with and follow. A lot of times these ranchers and landowners that we work with, they have a greater historical knowledge of the area. They know the land far better than those of us coming in ever would dream of. We just don't have the time and the funding to go out and do the real research it takes to get to know these lands. So we have to rely on their historical knowledge of these areas. They also have longer term management. These partnerships that we build with each of these ranchers through the education of the rancher, assistance in setting up their grazing management systems, giving them the tools and knowledge they need to manage both for their business but also for the conservation needs. We're setting up more knowledgeable boots on the ground and setting up this long-term management practice. The idea then being that, dad teaches son and teaches grandson, and it goes on like that, and then you get these 100 and 200-year-old ranches out there that have had these sustained management practices over time. We're also looking at vegetation management. A lot of these folks are very good at managing their vegetation. They know where the water is, they know what a dry year is like, and they know what a wet year is like. And so they're able to manage the vegetation. They're also out there constantly. New invaders, new species, they're found relatively quickly on a lot of these lands. And then these new issues can be addressed in a quick manner. And I think it was David who mentioned before balance, and I was very glad because I think that is the big take home. It doesn't matter what aspect we're looking at, whether it's the habitat or the management side, the production side. It's important that we find that balance that's going to work together and find that compatibility between our human needs and the needs of these species of interest. So our challenges. And I just threw this in because I wanted to talk a little bit about each of these, but didn't have time to really go in depth in all of them. Of course, funding is one that you have to throw right up there. We don't know what's happening. We've been in these continuing resolutions. We're receiving pretty consistent, regular cutbacks in our funding. And as in a program like myself, which is funded primarily off taxes and things like that, as the economy took a hit and people cut back on their spending, some of those funds got cut back as well. We just didn't have as much coming in. Other challenges are boots on the ground. Everybody's being asked to do more with less. We hear that all the time. Do more with less. Well, that includes the number of people we have out there doing this work. So the partnerships become even more and more important. NRCS and Fish and Wildlife has had, as we call it, a program or been working on what I think is a good example of how we can work together, get these additional boots on the ground. There are 3 or 4, Cece, do you know for sure? 3 or 4 people, they work both NRCS, partially funded NRCS and partially funded Fish and Wildlife. 4 now. These positions are, they're joint employees of both NRCS and the Fish and Wildlife, which is something that hasn't been done a lot in the past, that going over the department boundary there to bring in employees. And it's something that I've heard chatter here and there of some of the NGOs in the area, you know, the Audubon Society, people like that, going for funding and trying to do these similar situations where we're co-hiring people. These co-positions, not only do they give that particular individual a broader view of how agencies work together, they bring us together in a better way and kind of strengthen those internal partnerships, but they can also approach landowners in a multi-directional manner without bringing a horde of people out there and essentially ganging up on the landowners. One person can go out and effectively represent a larger swath of all of the available options out there for that land. Education, of course, is always a continuing and ongoing mission. CC has mentioned how, you know, we don't have as many people coming to us up there in the Modoc area, in the Lassen area. There aren't as many landowners coming forward. Well, it's certainly not from a lack of juniper that needs to be cut down, but some of it comes down to education. Continuing to talk to and spread the word about good this is, the opportunities that are out there, and try to put aside some of those preconceived notions. You know, try to help landowners to see that, you know, if they jump in bed with the government, they're not turning over their rights, they're not turning over their control of their land, but that we're there to really and truly just be as much help as we can. Climate change, of course, is always an issue. We're not entirely sure what's going to happen. We have to have several, you know, what if it gets drier, what if it gets wetter, what if it gets hotter, what if it gets colder, and try and figure out, in all these circumstances, what are we going to do out there? That takes more time, it takes more money to try and figure these things out. So climate change is a consistent challenge that we have to work with, and one that, without CC's crystal ball, we won't have any idea really what And then fire suppression. You know, it's a consistent and needed method to go out and fight these fires that go through areas, but we're also reducing the amount of consistent management that's out there, historic management that's out there. So trying to strike a balance between prescribed fires, letting fires burn through areas that aren't threatening human settlement or anything, and how do we strike that kind of a balance between the management of such a dangerous management practice. That is pretty much what I have for you. I will entertain any questions. I know there were some questions earlier about partners and how Fish and Wildlife is looking at things. So, any questions?
One of those folks in the federal buck, I suspect you've seen a wide spectrum of landowners and land management philosophies and try to find some. From the better ones that you've seen, real positive ones, what are some things we can learn from landowners who do a really good job? Because I know in the Forest Service, we're don't always do the best job. Any thoughts?
Often I find those landowners that, I don't know if you call them better necessarily. I've had very few very negative, what I would consider an extremely negative interaction with landowners. Most of them, it's just a cautiousness, you know. But for those landowners that are willing to just jump in way over their head and do the best they can, most of them it comes down to a real passion. Most of them the property has not been in the family for 100 years. They're newer large property landowners. Some of them are duck clubs, in fact. They're groups that have come together, and so their own group's joint knowledge has brought them to a point where they're interested in doing this. But we certainly have a lot of large landowners, centennial ranches and things out there that those landowners have jumped in feet first. A lot of times, the best way to get them, though, is examples. Taking them out, telling them, you know, so-and-so over here that's your neighbor, you know them, they've done a project and they'd like to invite you over and go and see it. So finding those successes and then getting those landowners to open up and talk to their other landowners, that's the best way, really, to get them out there. And so I think those that have successes and jump in, they're the ones most willing to do that. Any other questions? Yes,
So, you know, around certain parts of California, a lot more of the ranches are kind of quasi-commercial. They're medium-sized, and their values as a profit models are different. But do you get that going on in Roeder? How does it affect the work you're doing?
We don't have as many of the commercials. There's certainly some, but there's not as many up there. The commercial ones add a whole nother level of difficulty to the equation. Anytime you draw in a corporation or a large business, you also draw in their lawyers. And so that adds kind of a complication, but the few that I have worked with, I've not found that they are opposed to any of this work. They're generally, you know, proactive. We have some large timber companies, in fact, that you would think a timber company wouldn't want to cut down a single tree unless they were getting a buck for it, but some of them truly and honestly recognize the value of the meadows, of the lower lying areas that should not have this juniper in it that does, and they recognize the environmental value to that, and are willing to cut them down and maintain them as open, not replanting them, but maintaining them as open. It's just a matter of weeding through that extra layer of difficulty.